Hello and welcome to another DazToHue tutorial video. In this video we'll be taking a quick look at how we can use the new face controls that come with release 1.0 complete version. So here I have the Victoria 9 figure and I've just added some simple clothing. The only thing I've done in terms of preparation was to make sure that the figure components are on subdivision level 1. But the clothing I've left at the base subdivision level because they're already fairly high poly. So to get started, I'm going to go to where our DazToHue presets are saved. I'm going to go to Genesis 9 and we're going to make sure that we are on frame 0 on the timeline and that the root of our figure is selected. So this first node here needs to be selected. Then I'm going to hold down the control key on my keyboard and double click this G9 example ROM with Faceboard preset. The reason for holding down the control key is that will trigger this dialog box, and we want to make sure that turn off limits is enabled. And I'll click accept and we'll say yes. So now we have the ROM loaded onto our figure. Now for Genesis 9 only, it comes with a separate figure for its mouth internals, and because DazStudio doesn't let you save a preset that applies to multiple figures, what it basically means is we had to have a separate ROM for the mouth, and it just adds a couple of keyframes related to tongue posing. So what we're going to do now is load this other ROM, this G9 example ROM with Faceboard mouth, onto just the mouth figure. So again, we want to make sure our timeline is on frame 0. This time we want to make sure the mouth figure is selected. Again, we'll hold down control and double click this ROM, turn off limits, then accept. So now we have the complete ROM applied to our figure. First 3 frames are related to retargeting poses, then we have our joint corrective morph poses, and towards the end we have our facial poses. So now all we need to do is export these as FBX and Alembic. So we'll go to File, Send to Maya. Super important, we want to make sure the asset type is set to animation. I'm going to tick on this bake subdivision and then click on the subdivision levels. And again, we want to make sure that what we select here matches what's defined in the scene. So if you'll recall, I had my figure set to subdivision level 1. The clothing I'm going to leave at level 0. I'm going to export that. So we're finished exporting our FBX file. Now we need to do the Alembic cache. I'm going to go up to, in my case, Edit, Sagan Alembic Exporter. Now we want to untick right armature empties. You want to untick under Blender Houdini current sub D level, and we want to go to the Maya UE section and tick current sub D level. And then last and very importantly, we need to change the objects from %I to %N. We look up here, that's the untransformed node name that we want. Everything else looks good, so we're just going to hit export, wait for that to finish. So that's finished, we're just going to close that. Now we'll just gather those files together into a single folder. So I'm going to copy the bfig fbx file and the fig.dtu file into my characters folder. I don't need any of those others. I'm also going to copy the Alembic cache into that folder. We can get rid of that. So now I have the 3 files we need in our characters working folder. So here we are inside Houdini, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but this workflow is covered in greater detail in previous tutorials. So if you're unsure exactly what I'm doing, I suggest you go and look at some of the past tutorials. So I'm going to create our DazToHue geometry node and dive into that. And with our import node selected, I'm going to select the 3 files we just exported. So our FBX file, our DazToHue file, and our Alembic cache. While I'm here, I'm going to give it a name for our character. Then I'm going to move on to the skin node. I'm going to bring it into the viewport. Importantly, we can see that our point counts match. On the skin node, I'm going to define two skinned shapes. The first will be body. I'm going to select all of our figure's body components. And the second shape will be clothing. I'm going to select just the two clothing parts. Just to make sure I've done that correctly, we should see two options under the name attribute, one for our body, one for our clothing. Now this is a new feature of release 1.0. I'm going to tick under exclude from these morph generation categories for clothing. I'm going to tick the face. This is basically an optimization feature, which means that the clothing won't be considered when it comes to generating the facial morphs. You can see with this particular piece of clothing especially, it has no relation to the face. So in order to save both calculation time and memory consumption, we're going to exclude it from facial morph generation altogether. It's pretty rare that you would need to include clothing on facial morphs. Perhaps if you had a hoodie or something that came very close to the face, you might want to include it, but in this case we certainly don't need it. Moving on to the skeleton node. Change the viewport. Our source skeleton will be Genesis 9, and in this case I'm going to target the DazToHue native skeleton for Genesis 9. All these options, I think we're going to enable IK bones. We might as well add these helper bones as well, even though we don't need it for this particular tutorial. Everything else we're going to leave as is. Occlusion, I will do a quick occlusion of the legs, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So we're going to add a new occlusion group. Occluding will be, in this case I think I'll just do the legs, so it will be that one, and the body is what we're occluding. I'll just tweak these a little bit, bring some of that back. So I'm going to leave it at that, although we could do the top as well. I'm not going to touch the mesh node this time. Materials. I'm going to bring up eye moisture and isolate that. So the eye geometry, I'm going to, for Genesis 9, I select eye moisture left, eye moisture right. Genesis 9 comes with its eyes rotated outwards slightly, I'm not sure why, it just does. So we want to make sure that this crosshair lines up with the center of the pupil exactly. So we can use this control to adjust that. I'm just going to bring that across just to make sure that the eye shader is perfectly aligned with the eyeball. That's all we need to do for our eyes. Now while I'm at it, I'm going to go back to the import node and delete the rest of the eye geometry that we don't need. So I'm going to delete that from the FBX. That's the eye left and eye right. We don't need that. I'll do the same for the Alembic cache. What we need to do there. Now back to our material node. I'll define the rest of our materials. So I'm going to have body material in that be our body. I'm going to have face material. That will have our head. Actually, I'll call it head. What else? We need nails. And that will have our fingernails and our toenails. We'll have mouth. That will have the mouth and the mouth cavity and the teeth. I'm going to add one for the tear line geometry. I'll have the tear in it. I'm going to add one more for the occlusion geometry, which is this eye occlusion geometry. This is something I custom made for my figures. It's not included in DazToHue at the moment. It may do so down the track. So that's going to have the occlusion in it. And again, under isolate, I'll just see how we're tracking. So we need materials for the eyes, and the rest is all clothing. I'm going to add one for the eyes. That will have our left eye and right eye. And in this case, I'm just going to have a single material for both clothing pieces, even though you could separate them. I'll just call it clothing. That will have these band 1 and base 1. So now one last check to make sure we've captured all of our materials, and I've forgotten the arms and legs. So those I'm going to put under my body material slot. So I'll add arms and legs. Now you can see we have redefined our material slots for our figure. On the UV node, I'm just going to do what I always do for Genesis 9 figures, which is first going to move them all to the first UDIM. And then I'm going to define a UV texture atlas in which I put my body in the top left. Sorry, not that one. Put my body in the top left, my arms top right, my legs bottom left. Bottom right I reserve for anatomical elements, but in this case we don't have any. Now onto the pose assets node. All we really need to do is load the preset that's included. So if you recall, when we were in Daz, we used the G9 example ROM with Faceboard, so that's the preset we're going to load. So that's loaded. We can now scrub through and see it's calculating deltas for our joint corrective morphs. Towards the end, we'll have facial animation morphs. Finally, on the export node, I'm going to tell it where I want to export to, so I'll just use my standard folder. Now, because we're using the complete pack for DazToHue, we don't need to export anything other than the character. If you were wanting to create your own from scratch, you would likely need a lot of these. But for us, and just to save time, I'm going to untick everything but the character. Now I'm just going to export. So that's now finished exporting, and if we take a look at our export directory, you can see we have our FBX file there. So now it's time to jump over to Unreal Engine and take a look at how we can add the facial controls in there. So here we are inside Unreal Engine. In this case, it's just my dev project that I use to develop DazToHue. So what we'll do now is import the FBX file that we just exported out of Houdini. So the first thing I'll do is go to where I want to store it. In my case, it'll be Victoria 9. You can see I already have the textures set up that I use for Victoria 9, and I also have the materials already defined. Now I'm going to be covering the DazToHue skin material setup in another video, but for now we'll just gloss over that. So what I'll do is click on my meshes folder, and I will go to import. I'll navigate to where we exported that file, double click it. It will think for a little bit. Once the FBX import options dialog box appears, we'll just go over a few of the options. This is a skeletal mesh. We do want to import the mesh. Now, the benefit of having the DazToHue complete pack is that it also includes archetype skeletons for Genesis 3 through to 9. And that really speeds things up in terms of getting your character up and running. So rather than creating a skeleton on import, we're actually going to select the Genesis 9 archetype skeleton. So under the skeleton drop-down box, we just want to find SKL Genesis 9. If you look at the path in that popover box, you want to make sure it's the DazToHue native Genesis 9 skeleton. If you're obviously doing Genesis 8 or 8.1, you would pick the appropriate skeleton. I'll just scroll through these options rather than going through them all for you. Most of them are defaults, so smoothing groups, bone hierarchy, etc. I'm not going to worry about a physics asset in this case. And we don't need to import the animations in this case either, so I'll untick that. And in my case, because I have all the materials already set up, I'm not going to create materials on import. Because of the naming conventions I've used, it should auto-discover the materials I've set up for this character already. So with that, I'll hit the import button. And this can take a minute or two. So that's now finished importing. We can close this message log. First thing we'll do is double click on our skeletal mesh and set a few options in there. I'll just check that all my materials have been assigned, which they have. So there's 2 or 3 things we want to set on the skeletal mesh asset in order to get facial animations working. So up on the asset details panel under search, we're going to first search for post. Under post process anim blueprint, we want to select this ABP DTH Genesis 9. That's the post process animation blueprint that comes with DazToHue for Genesis 9 figures. We're then going to search for rig, default animation rig. In this case, we want to pick CR DTH Genesis 9. That's the control rig that's included for Genesis 9 figures. There's a couple of other things that aren't necessary for facial controls, but I do them anyway out of habit. I search for skin. Under skin case usage, I make sure that's enabled. That's necessary if you're having any grooms on your character. And then finally, back on the asset details panel under sections, I typically set the recompute tangents for most things that have morphs applied, so the body and the head in particular. So for the head, I'm just going to pick all in this case. And this does think for a little bit once you change them. I'll also do it for the body. And lastly, I'm also going to recompute tangents for the clothing. Once that's all done, we will save our skeletal mesh asset again. And then we can close that. Now, in order to test that everything's working, here I just have an empty stage scene. So I'm going to drag my skeletal mesh out into the scene and center it. You can see her there. Now, there's a couple of ways you can go about using control rigs, but in this case, I'm just going to come up to here and add a level sequence. And then under the level sequence, under track, I'm going to add our Victoria 9 figure. And while I'm here, I'm also just going to hide sprites. So you can see by default, it shows the body controls, but no facial controls. So we can now start to manipulate the character using the body control rig. In order to see the facial controls, I under the control rig for Genesis 9, under global options, you'll see that we have show body controls and show facial controls. By default, face controls are off, so we can just tick that on. That'll bring the face board for Genesis 9 into the scene. Now, with any luck, we should be able to start to manipulate these controls and see the face updating. Now, in the future release, I will be adding a control rig widget picker for all the Genesis characters. I didn't want to delay the launch of 1.0 any further, so it's not included at the moment, but it is something I'm working on. But at the moment, you can use the controls up here to manipulate the face. You can see we are getting wrinkle maps in the browse here. Wrinkle maps are a function of the material. So in my case, I'm using the skin packed material that comes with DazToHue. If you're using your own custom material and you don't have the wrinkle map set up in it, then you won't get wrinkle maps. And even if you are using the one that's included in DazToHue, you do need to make sure that wrinkle maps are enabled and that you've assigned the appropriate map. So if I have a look at Victoria 9 head material here, I have wrinkle maps enabled, and then I have selected the 3 textures it needs to work, and you can find those under DazToHue native Genesis 9 textures. So you need this array, wrinkle map array, and then you need the wrinkle maps 1 to 3, which are basically custom normal maps that I created for Genesis 9. So you can see if I turn that off, we lose the wrinkles in the forehead. If I turn it on, we get them back. So you are now free to start animating your character, both the body and the face in Sequencer. So that's about it for this tutorial. As I say, in the next tutorial, we'll have a look at the skin material that comes with DazToHue. It's also a work in progress. You can see here the version in release 1.0 doesn't have a makeup options, so it is something I'm working on to include makeup layer options in the master skin material. Now, I'm all about optimization, so in my case, I would probably bake the makeup into the existing character textures rather than having a separate layer, material layer to drive makeup. But it all depends on what you're needing for your project. But anyway, that is coming in a future release. So I'll leave that there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.